Blog Talk Radio.
Live from the nation's capital, it's Quintessential Listening, Poetry, with host Dr. Michael Anthony Ingram.
Quintessential Listening Poetry. My name is Michael Anthony Ingram, and our very special guest tonight is Mr. Bill Cushing. Bill Cushing lived in various states, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico before moving to California. As an undergrad, he was called the blue-collar poet by classmates at the University of Central Florida because of his years in the Navy, and later as an electrician on oil tankers, fishing boats, and other naval vessels before returning to college at the age of 37. Earning an MFA in writing from Goddard College in Vermont, he now teaches at East Los Angeles and Mount San Antonio colleges. Bill has been published in various literary journals, magazines, and newspapers, including the San Juan Star and the Florida Times Union. His short stories have appeared in Borfski Press, Newtown Literary Journal, and Sediments. Bill's poetry has been in numerous journals, both in print and online, including Avocet, Brownstone Review, Glomag, Mayo Review, Penumbra, Poetry Nook, Spectrum, The Song Is, and West Trade Review. He had poems, one of which was a Pushcart Prize nominee, in both volumes of the award-winning Stories of Music. In 2017, Bill was named one of the top 10 poets in Los Angeles, and this year's Spectrum Publishing named him one of the 10 poets to watch in Los Angeles. When not teaching or writing, Bill facilitates a writing workshop in Eagle Rock, California, part of the Nine Bridges writing community. He also performs with a musician in a project called Notes and Letters, a project that is available online through both Facebook and YouTube. He is now in the pre-publication stages for a full-length volume of poems with Finishing Line Press, scheduled for release in mid-2019. That book is tentatively titled A Former Life. Bill, are you with me?
I sure am.
All right, welcome to Quintessential Listening Poetry. I'm quite excited about your being here tonight, so I'm nervous. I'm excited because you're a fantastic poet, and I want to know more.
Oh, thanks much. Thanks.
Well, let me ask this question. What sparks your initial love of poetry?
Well, it's funny. I actually came to it with a very circular route, if you will. I was back in school. I just returned. I was in my late 30s at this point. And I was actually in the school newspaper and attended a seminar on how to improve your writing. And the woman who gave the seminar basically said, hey, you want to improve your writing in anything, learn to write poetry. And so that sort of started it. And as it would happen, the advisor of the newspaper was also one of my instructors, was Kevin Besner, who has been very involved in poetry himself. He actually studied under Stanley Plumley at Maryland and, is a big advocate of John Haynes and Rick Peabody and people like that. In fact, you may know Peabody out there in the D.C. area with Gargoyle.
Yeah. Yes. Well, let me ask this question. Why do you believe that poetry is important?
Well, it's funny because one of the things when I teach classes on this, I always say when you look at it to define poetry, and the best definition I ever heard was that poetry is a history of the human soul. And I think that's really applicable because, first of all, poetry literally started out as history. If you look at the Greek epic poems, they were the historical, recounting of events. But also, I'm a big believer in that if you look at when something was written, it reveals something not just about the writer, but the time itself. So I've always loved that definition. I think that's what makes it so useful in many ways, even though, yes, it's aesthetic, but it's also very utilitarian.
So poetry is the history of the human soul.
Yeah, I wish I could take credit for that one, but
it's a beautiful,
I always
beautiful
loved it.
statement.
I think that's the best. Yeah, that's the best encapsulation I've ever heard.
Well, let's begin this journey, Bill, by your sharing some of your work.
Yeah, and what I'll do, actually, this is the first poem I ever actually wrote that I would call a serious poem, besides from the, 15-year-old love poems and stuff like that. But
okay. All right.
This came about actually the very next day after the seminar when I went to breakfast. And this is called In Pink Neon. Chrome and black tile at breakfast again. Coffee so strong it pulls your eyelids back going down. And while last evening's drunks with 5 a.m. shadows use it to try to face the new day, women, legs on spiked heels, lift leather skirts to reveal specialties of the house, initiating a physical negotiation, trading the tangible for currency. Enclosed cuffed hand, scaling triangle of whole wheat drips from sunny side up. A single waitress covers ground. Butter, warmed by sun shining through slatted glass, slowly rolls down a stack of brown pancakes. Silverware clatters, china against china, napkin falls, voices chatter. While outside in pink neon, a sign glows. Best food in town. And it is. And
please. You plan to share more?
What?
You plan to share more?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorites, and it is funny because I do teach, and of course one of the big mantras of any writing teacher is you have to rewrite. You can never, settle for anything. And this actually came about, and I call it one of the few found pieces I had where it's been through some changes, but nothing really major. And it's actually, incidentally, the poem that Marianne over at The Song Is nominated for a Pushcart Prize a few years ago. And it's the title of the poem is actually a quote from Miles Davis. And it's called Music Isn't About Standing Still and Being Safe. Listen, 2 weeks after you died, 250,000 thronged by the St. John's River to hear the music you had spawned, hoping to see you, but even in death you never looked back. They were all there, Hannibal, Bird, Chick, JoJo, Red, Jocko, Bean, Dizzy, my favorite, Freddie Freeloader. Isolated you were a beacon, a flagship for messages of the heart, back to the crowd, unbowed, that proud dance walk, announced by muted horn that spoke and broke through all the bull and told us about a place miles ahead of everyone else. You spent a lifetime thinking for yourself, speaking to every generation, playing it all, jazz, blues, funk, rock, fusion. Categories took a back seat to creativity and rhythm, space and feeling, spirit. I remember fourth grade picking up a horn, then laying it down. Rock and roll was my world. What did I know? 7 years later I heard. It was in the garden where you brought me back to music. I walked all the way home, miles from that train station, my head pounding with sounds, frantic fast as the subway I spent the night on, those African rhythms you used decades before anyone else even thought to, filling my head, letting me know I'd have it all down cold if I could walk as cool as the notes you heard coming from miles. You had that thing, that style, that spark that was a blue flame jumping off a gas stove, igniting everything everywhere, touching the genetic resonant frequency in all. And
all right. Well, let me ask this question. In terms of In Pink Neon, as well as the piece you just shared, how does a poem begin for you? With an idea, a form, or an image?
I think it's more image, although, ideas are game too, but it's less form than anything else. I think the one of the things I'm a big believer in, and here again I harp on this in my classes, form follows function. So I don't worry so much about the form until I know what I'm trying to accomplish. So usually it's the images, although ideas are game too, I think.
Right. Now, do you sit and think through every word of every stanza, or do you write freely and allow the words to just flow?
I never worry. I think one of the problems, I never try and start with a finished product. That rarely ever happens anyway, so what's the point of trying? So just to give you one idea, a lot of the stuff I do comes out of random notes that I just take as I see images, jot them down, transfer them into a file, and then eventually I start seeing cohesion between the images and start piecing something together. So that happens a lot. But even there, if I know what I want to put across, it doesn't mean the first, second, or third draft is even going to come close to it. It rarely does.
Well, please continue this journey by sharing more pieces of your work.
Well, let me go with this, and this is one that was also posted on The Song Is, and this is one of my favorites. I grew up, I actually I was not a big fan of pop music when I was a kid. I listened to it, of course, and all that, but when I was home, my dad had all his classical albums, and I would listen to those. And one of my favorites was always the Pictures at an Exhibition by Mussorgsky. And this came out of that, which I always love to plug, that this is a poem that's based on a piece of music that's actually based on a piece of art. So I've sort of taken it full circle, I guess. But this is on Modest Mussorgsky's Bydlo. And Bydlo, just for background, is the Polish word for the ox cart, and that's what he's musically depicting. A shape appears and is gone, comes into view, disappears, until, cresting the hill, the spot blotting the sun, a cartload of hay takes shape. Emerging the wagon, oxen drawn, juggernaut pulled by 2,000 pounds, rolls between fields, grinding dirt, crushing stones. Sweating flanks of coarse matted hair cause slow rhythmic hammering, dull thunder as hooves pound earth. The ground moves to the sound of these hardened timpani. Beast and wagon pass, processional, as if solemn, and then recede slowly out of sight. A wake is left, strong, pungent odor of musk mixed with the sweet sharpness of the cut stalks being carried to the village beyond. End.
What about this particular piece makes it one of your personal favorites?
Well, I've always loved that piece of music, and I think it's the first impressionistic piece of music, a visual piece of music I ever remember encountering, and it's almost like when you listen to it, you can close your eyes and see the ox moving by you. The whole thing is great, but that piece in particular just stood out, and I just love the image of some. Here again, having grown up in New York City in the 20th century, and this image of a 19th century ox cart somewhere in the Far East or Eastern Europe really appealed to me.
It's a beautiful piece. Beautiful piece. Please share another.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, this is one I did pull this out, and it's something I still feel like I'm working a little bit on it, but I lived in Florida for years, and this is actually based on one of my neighbors, who was a real treat. The poem is called Impotence. Slouched in two chairs made up as one, he grips a can, flexes his wrist. Over the table littered with twisted metal, stale beer and smoke mix. Tense, he shouts at air. Lacking real targets, he threatens vague adversaries. A cigarette in hand, the smoking gun, ashes fall after each shot. End.
Tell me more about this particular piece.
Well, it was, I think I was trying to get to sleep. It was like 1 a.m, and this guy was down, and I lived in a garage apartment at the time I was going to school. And I hear this guy yelling, and I look out my window, and he's just sitting there in these chairs, and actually the two chairs made up as one chair had a hole in it, and the other one had no arms, so he actually combined two chairs to make one. And he's sitting there yelling at somebody and pantomiming, shooting whoever it was he was yelling at. And I was like, well, this is a weird scene. It was worth capturing.
Well, let me ask this question. What are some of the predominant themes that flow through your work?
That's interesting because, well, of course, it can be any number of things, but what I find interesting is not so much that it's predominant, but unusually frequent. And somebody pointed it out when I was working on my bachelor's, was that religion shows up a lot in my work. And I'm not particularly religious, but that's such fertile territory, I think. It lends itself very well. And the other thing is my father shows up a lot, and that is unusual for me. I mean, even the poem I wrote about my mother, my father shows up.
Your father shows up.
Interesting dynamic there. Yeah. But I would say, wherever I am, I mean, it can be between the city, it can be out in the woods or in the nature, whatever. I don't think anything predominates, although I do tend toward a lot of musical stuff, which, I enjoy writing about, and I continue writing, which is one of the ways I ended up meeting up with Marianne out that way.
All right. Well, let me ask this other question before we continue with your work. They say that to see the world with complete honesty, one should look to comedians, artists, and poets. What do you think emerges naturally from your work? What emerges naturally from your work?
I actually hope the artist part, simply because I do want my work to be as visual or sensory as possible, not just a written word or written description. I'm hoping that I think all great writers are able to induce as many senses as you can, and that to me is the real challenge in writing, is trying to get those sensory images in there. Yeah, I don't know. I have very few what I would call humorous poems. I have a couple, but not really much. Yeah, I would say the artistic, the visual, as well as sound and taste. Hopefully, I don't think I've ever achieved that one. But
all right. Well, let's take a brief break, and we'll be right back with Bill Cushing. This is Michael Anthony Ingram at Quintessential Listening Poetry. The telephone number is 646-787-1631. Our special guest tonight is Mr. Bill Cushing. He's sharing with us from Glendale, California. One thing that I'd like to share, though, in terms of an announcement, World Food Day Poetry is a competition for poets in the greater D.C. area. It's poetry to fight hunger. There's no entry fee. First prize is $1,000. The deadline is September the 9th. Guidelines for entering are on Facebook at Poetry X Hunger. Please enter. Worthwhile cause. And it's important for me to share that piece because, again, fighting hunger is an important issue. What's important to you, Bill, in terms of poetry? What ideas are important to share?
That's a good one. I don't know. I always liked. I think Donald Justice. I got to go to a workshop that Justice held, and one of the things he said was that a good poem should appear cinematic, and I've always found that a good way to read at poems is, can I picture it on film or on a camera or on a screen? But I think I don't know. Because a lot of people, I'm not I always feel like I'm more concrete, and yet I have a lot of friends who write that are very ambiguous, and I love the way they are able to achieve it. One guy in particular is a guy out of Florida I've known for years, Andy Rojas, who's I look at his images, and I'm just like, how did you even see that? I'm almost jealous. But I would say, I try and achieve that sort of cinematic effect, if at all, anything.
All right. Well, continue this journey by sharing more pieces. Thank you.
Okay. I did mention that, one of the things, this is another one of my early pieces, and I've always liked this one. I grew up on the water, and I still continue going sailing today and just love it. And this is called Sailing for Joseph Conrad. And the reason I dedicated it to him was when I read Heart of Darkness, there was a phrase in there that I loved, and I had to use it. So this is called Sailing for Joseph Conrad.
Right.
I have always taken the 4 a.m. watch, those 3 hours before dawn when, inhaling the moist sweetness of a new day, we awake and escape last night's darkness, leaving technology to experience quiet and primitive satisfaction. The ocean rushing underneath, its volume dependent upon current hull speed, spills a phosphorescent wake, the only natural source of light besides the moon. Rolling up and down, swaying into balance on the balls of my feet while cradling the warmth of a mug's contents. Soon, an orange sliver appears and grows as the sun finds the seam in the weld that fixes sea to sky. And
all right. What other books have inspired your poetry, similar to The Heart of Darkness?
I love Philip Levine, but and even though he writes much more extended stuff than I tend to, but I also always appreciated Heather McHugh, who is out of Ohio, and I think she works with a really nice, tight line that I've always admired. So those are two of the poets I really enjoy reading. Merwin, I think, is a very good one. I'm trying to think of some others.
Find yourself then reading. So you find yourself reading work similar to your own or totally different?
Probably different, yeah. And hopefully I pick up a few tricks along the way.
Okay.
I always say I tend to find myself writing almost in the style of whoever I'm reading at the moment, because their thinking or their structure will filter into me a little bit. But, even though I don't write that way, I just admire the way they do it. I think I failed to mention the other one I love absolutely is Sharon Olds, who I think is, I've read a lot of her stuff and used it in the classroom.
All right. We'll continue, Bill, with more of your work.
Well, let's see. Well, let me do, I'm going to actually, since we are in September,
yes,
maybe I'll pull this one out. And this one is called Final Flight. I slept through the initial collisions, those twin explosions, as steel and fuel met concrete and girder, for the final collapse into rock and powder of two towers meant as monuments to the grandeur of their century. I saw it from a safe distance, not living through events except for my own recall or replays of video. I can still note those, retrieve the day, but the single image I cannot shed, the one that refuses to leave my head, is that of people, the 200 left who, facing the option of burning alive, knowing at that moment they were indeed dead, chose instead, like Icarus, to spread their arms in almost welcome embrace of the quarter-mile journey back to Earth. And
that was beautiful. I could see Icarus. I could see Icarus. It was very, very powerful. Tell us about your process. Tell us about your process. Is it pen and paper, computer, notebooks? How do you write?
Well, it ends up, when I do my final drafts, it's on computer, but I keep I'm a big believer in journals. I have journals all over the place. So in fact, that was one of my sister's Christmas presents to me this year was a new journal, which I've already started filling up. But I've got them all over the place. So yeah, a lot of times, I mean, it's on napkins in the car. It's whatever. I'll see stuff and just okay, this looks good. I want to use this. In fact, why don't I do this? Since you're asking about the process, this is one of those I think that definitely came out of that. It's certainly a Los Angeles poem, but it's a collection of different images I've seen driving around Los Angeles, and it's called Easter Island in Koreatown. Sitting on a gallon paint can, delivering a weird brand of royalty to the curb of Vermont Avenue, his square face, brown, a cross between some ancient pharaoh and a gargoyle. His hands rest on blue-jeaned knees, fingers pointed down. Meanwhile, traveling south, bungeed secure in the back of a flatbed truck, a laughing Buddha stands. He signals touchdown while passing a neighborhood bar and grill, where from the window a neon sign proclaims natural light. And
your titles are really fascinating. For a beginning writer, what's important to consider when you're titling a poem?
Oh, God, that's a good one, too, because sometimes I have it right away. Other times I have no idea what it's going to be till I get done with it. In fact, that title didn't come till much later when I thought of this guy as kind of a statue like the Easter Island, the heads on Easter Island. But, of course, I saw him in Koreatown while I was driving around there. But, yeah, sometimes, I mean, there's times that I'll have a title and I'm like, that's just not working for what I want to do. So I don't worry. And once again, it gets back to that. I don't worry too much about what it's going to end up like right away. I just let it happen and then see how it goes and work on it from there.
But do you think that you were meant to be a poet?
Well, I may be late getting in the game, but I seem it seemed to become a real preoccupation with me. Possibly. I mean, I always knew I loved reading, I loved writing, but as you saw in my bio, I spent a good amount of time doing, shipyard work for the most part, and never thought of it, even though back then I was keeping journals and writing notes and stories and things like that. But the poetry didn't really enter my head until that time back in the late 80s when I went to that workshop, and I was like, I want to try this out. And it's, paid off for me. I mean, maybe not monetarily, but certainly, I guess psychically it's worked pretty well.
So does knowing that your poetry and your poems are published out there in the world, does it validate your being a poet, or just knowing that it's out of your system?
I think, I would probably write published or not. But the incentive to keep writing, I think, is the fact that I'm having a fair amount of success with it. But I've always said that, my secret dream is that I would love it if in 200 years from now somebody picks up one of my pieces and goes, yeah, I understand that.
Well, what do you see as being the role of poetry in modern-day society? Here again,
that idea of the history of the soul, but also John Gardner, the really great American novelist, always said that the role of the writer is not to try and design new things, it's to convey all that has already existed to his or her own generation. And that, I think, is the biggest thing that I like to try and do. Here again, I go back to, if anybody's ever read Sharon Olds' book, The Father, about her father dying of cancer, amazingly beautiful stuff, yet a brutal topic. Carolyn Forche in The Land Between, about when she was in El Salvador back in the 80s. Really good historical view, even though she uses the poetic devices. And that's sort of what I'm hoping I'm achieving somewhere along the line.
what do you want your poetry to do? What do you want it to do? And where do you want it to go? I think you just shared just a piece of that. Where do you want your poetry to go?
Well, here again, it's that hoping to get to a wider and wider audience as much as I can,
Yes.
Conveying to people, how I see things, how I hope they might see them, even if only for the moment. I mean, once they leave the poem, they can go back to whatever it is they go to. But it's that idea of just seeing what's going on around them or around me, and me sort of acting as, a tour guide, if you will.
Oh, a tour guide. That's a fascinating concept. Tell me more about being a tour guide.
Well, well, for example, I mean, I've written about, my wife is Peruvian, and I've been to Peru, and I've written about that. I lived for 3 years in Puerto Rico. I have several poems that have come out of that experience. Of course, being from a big city, that factors in, and trying to convey to people, this is what it's like there. Let me put it this way. I would not dare try to write about farming. I have no experience in it. I have nothing to say. I know nothing about it. I wouldn't even bother trying.
All right. Well, who are you as a result of writing poetry? What, in terms of, you've done so much in terms of your lived experience. Who are you as a result of writing these poems?
Good question. I think it's helped make me a better instructor or teacher. That, I think, has helped a lot.
How so?
I think well, in terms of, teaching, that, one of the things that I admire about is the compactness of language, jamming as much as you can into a single word, as much imagery as you can get there. And I think it's made me better in that regard, where I can hopefully pull things down. In fact, a lot of times when I write prose pieces, I go to these sites and publications and say, okay, no more than 500 words, no more than 200 words. And the challenge is, hey, can I get it down to that and still convey what I'm trying to convey?
To still convey your message. Well, let's take a brief break and we'll be right back. I'd like to welcome you to Quintessential Listening Poetry, also known as QLP. We're here with our very special guest, Mr. Bill Cushing. Bill, will you share some more of your work?
Sure, certainly. And what I like to do, I mentioned, and I have to credit my wife for this one, when she first took me to Peru, of course, we had to take a trip to Machu Picchu. And
right.
This was something written about not Machu Picchu particularly, but about Cusco, and especially the people there. Just to let people know, when you hear a very strange word, it actually is the Quechua words I managed to extract from somebody there, from one of our cab drivers. I said, hey, what does this mean? What does that mean?
Okay.
So this is called Cusqueños. Up where the mountains curl like sleeping dragons, peaks piercing far above the clouds, in another world 2 miles above sea level sits the center of the Incan Empire, Cusco, a papute, belly button of the world. Like a crouching panther, this place, all diagonal slopes, everything hard stone, boulders, smooth squares of gray granite the size of a room, cobblestones, loose ovals of softer pastels, and of course, in the landscape is the weighted masonry of churches with arches lifting statues, promising spirituality, but instead delivering conquest. In the morning comes the hammering from the town square. A stonemason crouches amid rocks, boulders, and stones. His song rings out with each ping of the steel, striking on the rock he works on. Not far, the finisher chips discreetly on the rough work, trimming the rock into shapes that could easily have come from a lathe. Then there are the people, the Cusqueños, trudging along the sloping roads and paths. They carry belongings or wares in the licla, colorful blankets, sprouting babies, flowers, hay, or more stones, the wraps that wrap around stooping shoulders and seem to push the carriers into their own incline as they make their shuffling way up these narrow and steep streets, while we tourists steep cocoa-tea in our rooms, attempting to adjust to the heights. At midnight, we bolt awake, our bodies gulping air to catch breath, feeling a tingling in fingers. We drown in thin air. The Cusqueños, like the stones surrounding them, are squat, browned with hearts enlarged and noses slightly widened, equipment for the altitude. The old ones peer through occidental eyes, cracked and peeling from age and knowledge ancient and pure. The look says, Nucanchus augmenta casanchus. We will endure. And
you know, that could also be a short story. Have you ever thought about expanding it?
Not really, because I
Not really?
Yeah. That is funny, though. I hadn't thought of it. But it is funny, though, because I've had some stuff where something started as a poem and ended up in a story because it wasn't working as a poem, or something started in a story and it didn't fit, so I, extracted it and made it into a poem. So I'm willing to shift gears.
All right. I know that you do write short stories. What do you view in terms of importance? What are some of the qualitative differences between writing poetry and fiction?
Well, I got to say, even my fiction is really not fiction. It usually comes out of my own experience. And in fact, that was my MFA was in creative nonfiction. So I'm trying to think. I've written a couple of really fiction short stories. But generally it's because there is some sort of narrative development going on. Whereas to me, the poem is sort of crystallizing a single moment and then expanding out on it. The short story is all the moments leading up to the main moment and then what happens afterwards. So I guess that was, and here again it gets back to the form follows function. What's the point of what I'm trying to do, and that'll determine whether it's a short story or an essay or a poem or whatever.
Well, speaking of creativity, from an existential perspective, what exactly is creativity in 5 words or less?
Oh, God. Well, the word art comes from the Latin, but the word art comes from the Latin artifice, which is where we get artificial. And I've always said art is the action of taking the organic and creating something wholly new, using natural elements. And in writing, I would say the natural element is the language, and you're trying to use it in a way that people haven't done before, which I guess gets back to the, I believe it was it Eliot who said, make it yours. So that, I would say, is probably the best way of looking at that question.
All right. Well, continue this journey, Bill, in terms of sharing your work.
Okay. Well, let me, let's see. Well, this is a little different view of South America, and it came from looking at some of the households there. And what struck me down there was the difference. We hear a lot about economic differences in this country, but the economic differences down there are way more pronounced than anything I'd ever seen before. And this came out of that, and it actually is built on a single image that I did see, and once I saw it, it just spiraled into this thing. It's called Two Stairways. The first greets those who promenade through the foyer to a sunken living room. Its steps, wide with carpeted tread, ease beneath gilded panels, lined with portraits of staid patriarchs, long dead. Bright red lips brush fair cheeks. Besitos da cultura alto. As these elegant guests parade through the living room, past a massive dining table and walls affixed with innocuous ceramic buttons, doorbell fixtures to summon the help. From the kitchen hiding a second staircase, steep, jagged, and above all concrete. Servants, rough hands wrapped in skin, darker than the mahogany furniture they rub to a high shine, trudge between floors, carrying the weight of meals, loads of laundry, flutes of lemon water, and whispered curses, triggered by constant buzzing commands. Meanwhile, quiet worms of hate burrow, deep yet imperceptible, into their hearts. End.
Right. Your work is very intricate. So to you, what are some of the prevalent ingredients that go into this concoction we call a poem? How do you create one?
Well, I say a lot of it is just taking, the images from that came from different places, but they all bound into one central thing, which was, this difference between the people who own the homes and the people who work there.
Right.
So.
You share with me. Okay, I'm sorry. Excuse me, please.
At you, why not? This is one of my Puerto Rican pieces, and it's actually off the east end. I spent a year out in Fajardo, which on the east end of the island, and there's a series of smaller islands, Dos Feques and Los Palominos are two of them, but this was based on one called Los Carabas. Plank by plank, the snowy egret approaches, stalking a crushed milk carton as a sliver of moon drops, waiting between the fading light of today and the dropping of night's velvet curtain that reveals an array of stars uncensored by the glow of shopping centers. The chorus of coquis playing percussion ushers in the evening. End.
All right. Would you share that one again, please?
Sure. By the way, just to explain, the coqui is I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a small frog-like animal, but they only reproduce on the island. They can live elsewhere, but they just don't reproduce. And they make this very strange sound. And the line in Puerto Rico is, it's the first thing you notice when you arrive, and it's the first thing you miss when you leave. That's Los Carabas. Plank by plank, the snowy egret approaches, crushed milk carton, as a sliver of moon drops, waiting between the fading light of today and the dropping of night's velvet curtain that reveals an array of stars uncensored by the glow of shopping centers. The chorus of coquis playing percussion ushers in the evening. And
I like that. You shared with me earlier. You shared with me earlier that you read a lot in the Los Angeles area. What is the relationship between your speaking voice and your written voice? Is there a relationship between the two?
Well, and here again, that goes into the formation of whatever I'm working on. Is I do try and capture my own meter, if you will, when I'm writing, so that when the person reads it, hopefully they capture a little bit of my voice, if only in the pacing.
All right. Well, the telephone number is 646-787-1631, and I think we have some callers on the line. Hold on one moment, Bill.
Oh, okay.
Good evening, area code 301-627. You're on the air.
Hey, Michael, it's Hiram LaRue. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Hiram. How are you, sir?
Just fine, and I'm just here to listen tonight, but I did really want to thank you for hosting Mr. Cushing. His work is great, and also for mentioning the World Food Day Poetry Competition. Really appreciate you mentioning that and pointing folks to the Poetry X Hunger Facebook page where they can find the guidelines. It's for folks who are kind of in the greater D.C. area, but anyone who's interested in hunger should consider, anything they could do, poetic or otherwise, to fight the scourge of hunger. Thanks very much, though, Michael, for all of that shout-out.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Hiram. All right, we've got another caller. Area code 678, you're on the air. The first three numbers are 362. All right, that caller, too, is probably listening. All great writers have great writing influences. What makes these influences great in your eyes? Some of your writing influences.
Oh, boy. And it's funny because probably the one that I admire most is not a poet, although he has dabbled in it and done it. But Anthony Burgess, the British writer who is probably most famous for Clockwork Orange, but that is hardly his best work. I've always just loved his stuff. One of them, the Napoleon Symphony, where he writes a fictionalized account of Napoleon's life, but tries to pace the four sections of the book according to the four movements of Beethoven's Third Symphony.
All right.
I just love reading his stuff.
Well, please share some more of your work, Bill.
Sure. This, sticking with my water theme that seems to be going on anyway. This is another one, actually one of the earlier ones that I wrote when I first started back in the late 80s, maybe early 90s, but I've always enjoyed reading this one. And by the way, I always like to say if there's such a thing as reincarnation, I'd like to put in a request. This is called Pelicans.
Okay, Pelicans.
So this is Pelicans.
Okay.
Slowly circling, the pelican drops like a stone into water. Then climbing the air, he stops and, with a single motion of wings, glides on the wind. End.
I'm allowing that one to sink in. If possible, name 3 poems you are most proud of writing, the ones that you personally cannot forget.
Oh, boy. Well, that one is certainly one of them. The In Pink Neon I love, just because, and just as a kind of a reveal, I was thinking of Tom Waits when I wrote that one. The other one I really like, and it's interesting that all 3 of them are some of my earlier stuff, but I wrote a poem called Some Notes of a Religious Nature, and I do like opening with that one. Yeah, sure, let me go ahead. This is Some Notes of a Religious Nature.
Okay, thank you.
Jesus was sent to die for our sins like some package from UPS. He delivered the goods to humanity, and we delivered him back to heaven, battered, beaten, mutilated, some creation we turned out to be. And
one more time.
Sure.
That was a fascinating piece. Please, one more time. I want to savor that one.
Okay. So, Jesus was sent to die for our sins, like some package from UPS. He delivered the goods to humanity, and we delivered him back to heaven, battered, beaten, mutilated, some creation we turned out to be. And I guess I should actually say amen at the end of that one.
The end, amen, that's pretty much synonymous. They're the same.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Please favor us again.
We're
on a roll
something else,
now.
I assume.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, trying to see what I've got here that's right in them. Well, here's one that this is actually a fairly new one, but it deals with, and here again, Marianne posted this just recently on her blog page. The song is, and this I wrote for Marcus Roberts, who I don't know if you're familiar with him, but a phenomenal pianist who actually came out of Jacksonville, and I got to meet him there and actually interview him. But I was thinking about him not too long ago, and I came up with this, and it's called Singing with Both Hands. With 88 steps to choose, how do the pianist's hands decide which to use? Perhaps each acts alone. One is the heart, maintaining clockwork tempo, balanced, beating as blood and milk, giving life in obsidian or porcelain. The other wanders free, travels against rhythm, turns at times unknown, sees dead ends, backtracks to others, sometimes climbing, yet always acting in concert, or not. The end.
Wow. You know, we have another caller, and let's find out whether he or she is, let's see. Good evening, area code 301. The first three numbers are 710. You're on the air.
Hi, Bill. Hi, Michael. I just wanted to say how much I'm enjoying the show tonight, and not just because.
Great. How did you hear about it, if I can ask?
That's Marianne.
How did I hear about it? Gee, somebody's posting stuff on Facebook about it.
Oh, are they
I'll
really?
be damned. Who's that?
Probably someone's cousin. Trying to be supportive. Well, thank you, Marianne. As always, it's due to you that we've been able to bring this show to the air. So, again, I thank you so very, very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, Bill, do you have another piece of poetry for us before we close out?
Yeah, well, actually, let me go with this. Oh, geez, do I have it all? Apparently not. We have a son who is pretty severely disabled, and this is one of the pieces that I wrote about him. And I'm actually very proud. This did not win the grand prize, but there's a contest every year in Texas dealing with people with disabilities and that kind of thing. And I was a finalist that year, but it didn't take the grand prize, although, truth be told, I read the grand prize winner, and it was phenomenal stuff. But anyhow, this is called Gabriel's Coming. Things did not turn out as perfectly as we had hoped. When the doctors extracted him from the womb, there he was, a twisted pretzel of a person, this child who was to be perfect, shaking and bloody as a wounded bird, and not much different. From the bony shoulders, like broken wings, crooked arms splayed up to the curled hands that seemed jammed under a quivering chin, attached haphazardly to a crooked head. Hips perpendicular to a withered torso, legs running up the sides of a pruny chest. All these deformities from blood that had clotted in the brain, a stroke. So a malady of the elderly became his personal anomaly. Blood-soaked, crooked, crying, and brain-damaged, this was how we greeted our son. Yet from those bodily barricades and out of that unquenchable panic came a boy who did not interrupt a family, did not join a family, but who created a family. And
that was beautiful, Bill. Thank you for sharing. What is your son's name?
It's Gabriel.
Well, let's dedicate tonight's program to Gabriel.
Thanks so much.
Right. All poets have several words that come up over and over and over again. Words or sentences that they just can't help but use in their work. What are three of your absolute favorite words?
Oh, God, there's a trick question.
I'm working hard here. I'm working
yeah,
hard.
I cannot come up with it out of the top of my head. I think I try and focus on nouns and verbs more than anything else. I would say if there's any set of words, it's that. Trying to avoid adverbs and even as many adjectives as I can, trying to get things across. Because I always say that nouns and verbs are the most concrete pieces of any language, and I think here again, poetry should be something that's concrete. So I can't think of particular words, but of the types, I would say nouns and verbs are what I focus on.
Do you have another piece for us?
Sure. I'll end with this one, and this actually comes out of an exercise I like doing with some of my writing classes, and I always participate, and I find it results in some pretty interesting work. And in fact, I love to brag about this one now because Moontide Press down in Los Angeles last year published a collection of SoCal poets, L.A. poets, and the title actually came from this poem. So I was so stoked when the editor wrote me and says, "Hey, look, obviously you're in. I'd like to call it this." So the book is called A Lullaby of Teeth. The poem is called Alpha Dreams. The wolf bares fangs even when sleeping. Legs move in rapid dream twitches. Cheeks quiver from tickling branches that swipe his head. Leading the hunt, he chases with others of the pack. Sweaty fear fills his nostrils, and sanguine expectation tingles through his thighs. Nipping, then ripping at the flanks of a deer, they jump with him as one. Then the imagined pack straddles its fallen meal, dining without grace. A lullaby of teeth, as enamel scrapes against bone, and the song of sinew, stretching before tearing free from the cooling carcass, fill his night. End.
Do you have a writing community that you work with?
Yeah, well, the Nine Bridges group, which is actually out of Portland, and I facilitate one of their workshops, is probably
Portland,
the most
Oregon?
regular. But there's a couple of other.
Portland, Oregon?
I'm sorry?
You say
yeah,
Portland,
they're actually
Oregon?
started. That's how they got the Nine Bridges name, was because of Portland. But they have a couple of chapters down here, and I was lucky enough to abscond with one of them, and been working with them for about 3 or 4 years.
I really, really enjoy your work. I really do.
Oh, thanks so much.
I enjoy your work. What's next for you in terms of being a poet? What's next for you? Where do you go from here?
Well, like I say, my biggest project now is finishing up the book I'm trying to get published, and I'm hoping by March of next year, actually. But working on that. And I am actually, as far as a poet, one of the things I'm going back to, which I don't do a whole lot, is very structured. Like I just wrote a sonnet. I'm working on a sestina. So the more, I guess, the older disciplines of poetry, which I tended to not go to, but I'm trying to get into that now. In some of my newer work is using those forms and trying to stay within the restrictions that they set up, which I find is a great exercise.
Well, I'd like to thank you very, very much for being our guest tonight. Everyone, Bill Cushing is an extraordinary poet, and I'm glad you were here with me.
Well, thanks so much for putting up with me, and I'm glad I could be on there.
All right. Thank you. Have a good evening, Bill.
You too now.
To everyone.
Bye-bye.
To everyone, good night. Good night.
All right. Well, thanks so much. Hope that didn't go out over the air.